What's up YouTube, this is Dennis Panuta for tutorials.eu. In this video you are going to learn about JSON and Gson. And JSON is basically something that you will need all the time, and Gson is something that you will need specifically for Android development. So this is going to really help you out to understand what JSON objects are, how to read JSON, how to use JSON in your Android project, and then even up that and increase your productivity and your efficiency by using a third-party library called Gson. So JSON and Gson. And by the way, you might notice that the sound quality is slightly differently even though I'm using the same microphone, and that is because I have finally figured out that I have an RTX graphics card and I can use something called RTX Voice, which basically uses AI or machine learning in order to get rid of all of the noise in the audio. So there might be a shift in sound quality from what you can hear now to what you hear in the actual recording of the content of this video. But for future videos, I'm definitely going to use RTX Voice, which is freaking awesome. So if you have an RTX, definitely check that out for your meetings that you have using your microphone. It will do wonders to your audio quality. And then there's one more thing. Please hit that like button and the subscribe button. It really helps out this video and the YouTube algorithm. This is another 40+ minute video where I'm going to teach you everything that you need to know about JSON, Gson, and all of the good stuff for your Android projects. And also leave a comment if you like the video or if you have any questions, any feedback on what should come, and a little bit of an update on what I'm going to work on throughout the next weeks. And that is a new course. So I'm working actually on multiple courses in parallel. Might not be the most efficient way, but that's just how it works for me, working with some of my employees and working on good content. And basically we are working on a shop app. So we're going to build a shop app. I did a survey, and the ones that have my Android masterclass, they could answer that survey and they could basically influence the next course, which will be the shopping app. And in that shopping app, we're going to use Firebase and Firestore, and it's going to be amazing. So there will be a little teaser video coming up in the next weeks, and also some other content from that course. You will also get roughly a quarter or a third of the course here on YouTube, so be prepared, as well as a bunch of very useful demos that will definitely help you to become a better Android developer. So hit that subscribe button right now if you want to not miss out on any of those great videos, and also hit that notification bell because it's going to be amazing. All right. So now enjoy this video. Thank you very much for being with me. Let's get started. All right, so let's get started with JSON. And I don't mean Jason Statham as one might expect based on the name, but I'm talking about JSON, which is written like this. And we are going to start with JSON, and then we're going to look at Gson, which is very similar to JSON, but it's a G instead of a J. And that's a third-party library that we're going to use to make our life even easier. So first we are going to start with what JSON is and how to use JSON. And if you want to read along and want to basically get the code as well, not having to type everything in manually, you can get it on my website, tutorials.eu. And then, well, you can actually also find the link in the description down below. All right, so let's get started with what JSON stands for. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it is basically used in order to exchange data. And usually you would find JSON data for all kinds of data that you would find on the internet to display it in a certain manner for your website or your application or whatever. So you get the data, and then it's your task to do whatever you want with the data. For example, if you want to get weather data, or if you want to get the latest results of sports events, or whatever one could think of putting online in a workable format, in an easy to use and consume format for an application, they would use JSON. Even though the XML format is an alternative format, but that's something that is quite old-fashioned, I'd say. Basically nowadays you would really prefer to use JSON, and that's also what you would usually also get in terms of the type of structure of the data that you get. Let's look at the JSON object. So here, this is an example of a JSON API response that you would get. So basically what we are doing is we are most of the times requesting the data via an API. So we get an API response. We send it, for example, to openweathermap.org, and this could be the structure in which we get the data. So this is the JSON format, and you can see you get a bunch of information. For example, the city, the code, the message, the list of details of the weather, for example, the temperature during the day, the minimum, the maximum, night, and so forth. So you get a bunch of data, even though you might be confused about the values that you get here, and that is going to be probably Kelvin, I guess. So if it's 293, that should be something around 22 degrees Celsius. And yeah, basically this is the structure in which you would get JSON data. So if you have a list, then you would use square brackets. If you just have objects that are structured inside of it, then you are using curly brackets, and basically a JSON object always starts with curly brackets. So we have JSON objects inside of this JSON object, which is, for example, the city, which contains a JSON object that has a bunch of info, the ID, the name, the coordinates, and the coordinates itself is also a JSON object that you would get, for example, the longitude and latitude, and this is the city. Then you have code, which is basically just simple information, just a string. You can see you can get the information in a float format and an integer format, and you can even get a whole list of, then again, JSON objects. So this is another JSON object here, and it could be even longer. So you can see that with those dots here. Quick pause. So you're learning something about Android in this video, and I hope you enjoy it. If you want to learn everything that you need to know to become a real Android developer, then definitely check out my Android Masterclass, because in this course, you're going to build a bunch of great applications along your journey to becoming an Android developer. First, you're going to learn the Kotlin basics. Then you're going to learn to build one app after another. And while you do that, you get a bunch of demos which will really dig deep into the concepts, as well as presentations which will help you to understand what you're learning. So don't miss out and get the course right now. You can find the link in the description below. And basically, if you have a list, it starts with a square bracket, then you can have a bunch of JSON objects in there, and it ends with a square bracket, even though they don't have it in this particular example. But for this weather here, for example, you would have the weather, which can be a list of multiple objects, and it starts with just one, or it contains only one, and it says the weather is only ID 800. The main information, it's clear, and the description is the sky is clear, so a little more text about it. And then you have a specific icon where they say it's the icon 01D. So if you would want to use their icons, you could even use the icon for example, for clear weather. Okay, so this is just an introduction to what JSON objects can look like. This is really just one example. We have a very different example for our own data. So if you want to look at that, you will see that we have a list of users, okay? And we have a bunch of information about the different users. So we get the data from, let's say, an API that we're using, and we want to display that data in our application. For example, if you use a tool such as Facebook, well, they also store their data, or they make their data available in JSON format, and you would always just get a part of the information, of course. So we need to understand JSON once we want to make more complex applications that communicate with the internet. Okay, and that is the situation rather quickly when you are an Android app developer. At one point you realize, okay, I need to understand JSON, I need to understand APIs, I need to know how I can get this data from the web and then use it in my application. And in this video, we are not going to focus on how to get the data from the web. This is something that we do in my complete Android Masterclass, for example. And if you leave a comment in the description and say definitely create a video on that, well, if that comment is going to be liked quite a lot, then there is a chance that we are going to create such content as well. But basically what we're going to focus on is really JSON itself. So how to get this format into basically then displaying it in this format here. Okay, where we have the different information and we display them in an easier to consume manner, because what we had there was JSON, a format that is still rather easy to consume, I'd say, but still is not something that you would like to display in an Android app directly. So what do we have here? So this whole thing here starts with a curly bracket. So it goes all the way down here. This is a JSON object, this whole thing. And it contains this users list, which is a list of JSON objects. And it starts with the square bracket and it ends with a square bracket here at the bottom. Inside of it, we have a bunch of objects, which is a list of objects, right? So this is the first element of this list of objects, and it has an ID, a name, property, an email, a gender, weight, height, phone number, which itself also has more details. So this phone has a mobile as well as an office detail. So a property for mobile and a property for office. And I'm talking about properties here because this is something that you can really reuse in an object kind of format. And that's something that is allowed by basically converting it into a JSON object. Okay, this here. Because there are a bunch of classes that Android provides. And it's the JSON object one, JSON array, JSON stringer, and JSON tokenizer. I think at this point I have talked quite a bit about the JSON objects. And the JSON arrays are basically the list that I was talking about. So if you use the JSON array class, well, that's what it is. Then the JSON key value, that's for example the username, and then whatever comes afterwards is the value. So the JSON key value pair is basically this is the key. So here username is the key, and Dennis Panuta would be the value. And then we have a bunch of parsing functions. So functions that allow us to get information about this particular object or JSON array that we're looking at. So we can get the index of that object, we get the type, the length, meaning how many entries do we have in this array. This can be very relevant because you potentially want to loop through them to get all of the data. Then opt, which returns the object type, and the opt type, which returns the value of the mentioned object types in a JSON array on a particular index. So now let's actually use all of that because I'm 10 minutes into this video and I haven't even started building a project with you yet. Let's do that now. And by the way, it was important for you to understand these kind of things that I was talking about for you to get a better feeling for what we are actually going to do, because we are going to now look at how we can use all of those JSON objects in an Android environment. First of all, using the classical JSON parsing methods, and then using a third-party library, which is going to make our life significantly easier because it offers you a bunch of options that basically reduce the code that you have. You have less boilerplate code, and that means that you can basically get quicker results with less work. All right, at this point, let's create an empty object project, and I'm going to call this one JSON example. And we're going to use Kotlin as the language, as well as the minimum SDK being Android 5, because then it runs on most devices, which is what we want, because we're not using any latest and greatest technology here. We are really just using the basic functionality that Android offers. All right, the next thing that I want to have is a folder where I can put my assets. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new, so here at the top level, at the app level, I'm going to create a new folder, and you can find it here, folder, and I'm going to call this one, or going to select the asset folder here. And well, let's basically just click finish. That's going to be fine. Now we have assets. So this is the new folder. Inside of this assets folder, I want to create a new file. So right click, new, and I'm just going to create a file here. I'm going to call this one users.json. Okay, so here I'm going to copy in basically what we got here, right? So make sure to copy this whole code here and paste it into the project here, because this will be our users data. And this is something that you could also get from the web, and it would contain significantly more data, but we just have 3 users here, or actually it's 4 users, and we kept it very simple. We have a little bit of information about those users, and that's basically it. And by the way, I'm not 182, I'm rather small, I'm 169, and I'm also less heavy. Okay, so this is the users.json file, and now I want to use this in order to display its data in my UI. Now let's go ahead to our build Gradle, so our build.gradle file, and here I want to add an implementation, and down here. So basically you can see all of those different implementations that we have. All right, and at this point, add this implementation here, saying com.google.android.material, material, 1.2.0, and make sure that you sync it. So if you make changes here in your Gradle file, you have to sync now. Once you added this line, click on sync now, and then it will take a little while. Your Gradle will do its magic, and then you should go to your activity main, because that's where I want to add a recycler view. So here I have added this recycler view, and basically I just pasted it in. You can copy this code from my website, as I stated earlier. And if you have no clue what a recycler view is, I would highly recommend that you first check out what a recycler view is before you move on, because we are going to use adapters and all of the kind of stuff that is connected to recycler views. Basically, it's just a list, right? But you definitely need to understand that. And I created a video that teaches you recycler views in depth and really makes everything clear. Okay. So once you have the recycler view, you also need to define how your item should look like. Okay. So I'm just going to create a new file in my layouts, a new XML file, and here new layout file, which I'm going to call item_user_layout. So this is going to be my individual layout, and you can even keep the root element as constraint layout. Everything is fine. I'm just going to override it anyways. And basically what I have in here is how I want one individual item to look like. Okay, you can see it here. We have the ID, the name, email, gender, weight, height, mobile number, and office number. And you guessed it, this is the information that you can find in every single user. Okay, so this is the JSON object that contains all of the details for one particular user. Then this is the second object, and with the third object, and so forth. Okay, so this is what this item user layout should all take care of, and that's the code for it. And again, check out the code on the website, because this video is really not focusing on how to create a UI. I really want to focus on JSON. Okay, now the next thing is a little more interesting and a little more relevant to this particular JSON example. So because we are going to require a data model. Okay, so I need to have a new folder, or I can create a new folder. You could, of course, also just create a new class, but I'm just going to create a new folder in here, which is going to be a new package, and I'm just going to call this one model. Okay, and in this, I want to have my new Kotlin file class, and it will be a Kotlin class, which I'm going to call user model class, because it is going to be the model class for a particular user. So basically it should contain all of the relevant properties that my user has. And what are those properties? Let's look at it. It's the ID, it's the name, email, gender, weight, height, phone, mobile, office. And what really helps is if your class has those in the right format and the right naming as well. So let's look at it. So I need to have the value ID, which will be of type integer, the name, which is of type string, email, which is of type string, gender is also a string. The weight, if we look at it, is a double value, or it could be a float, but I'm just going to use double here. The height will be an integer. So here height is int, mobile is a string, as well as the office is also a string, as you can see here. So it's not numbers. You could, of course, store a mobile and an office number as a long value, but I think it makes more sense to use them as strings. And it really depends on what the data is going to be like. If you get the data in a long format, well, then you of course have to use the long data type here. Okay, but as it is a string, I'm going to use string. So now I'm getting this error here, and you might be confused about where this error comes from, because what's the problem with this class? Well, because it is going to be a model class, a data model class, which is super basic. We don't need curly brackets here, but just rounded brackets. Okay, so just basic brackets here. And then the error disappears, and this is basically how a model class will look like. And these are going to be all of the different values that we are going to get from such a JSON file. Okay, now at this point we need to have an adapter, and we are going to use an adapter class that I'm going to create here. So new Kotlin file class, this will be a new class, and I'm going to call this one user adapter, and I'm going to need that one for my recycler view. Okay, so if you were wondering what this whole recycler view is and all of that, as I said, check out the video on recycler views. All right, and for all of those errors to disappear, I also needed a bunch of imports. So you definitely need to import context, then the layout inflator view, view group, recycler view, and so forth for all of this to work. You see, I'm using the user model class as my model for an individual item in my user adapter. That's why I needed to import that. But again, I'm going to skip that user adapter here, because basically I'm just assigning whatever item I'm getting to my holder, which basically holds the TV item, which is, if you look at it, that's our user adapter, which then basically holds view.tvID, which is, if we look at it, this design. So what those three things do, and I explained that on a very high level here, because just to refresh your memory, if you have watched the recycler view video a while back, basically we always have this connection between a recycler view, an adapter, and the actual view. So this is the actual view, which contains all of those different view elements. And I want to assign the ID that I get from my model, from my user model class. I want to assign it to this particular view element. What is this view element? Well, it's this text view, which has this ID called TV ID. And if we look at our user adapter inside the view holder, we can see that we're using view.tvID, which basically just means for that particular item that we're looking at, I want to assign the text view ID, and I want to assign it to the value TV ID, to this variable basically that we're creating. And this by itself is then bound with the bind view holder or on bind view holder. So once this method is called, it will bind whatever item.id is to our holder.tvID text, which will then basically allow this here to display the right ID, the right name, the right email, and so forth for each and every one of our users. So for user 1, for user 2, for user 3, and so forth. Okay, and now let's see how all of that is coming together. And we're going to do that in our main activity class. So let's look at it. We're going to need a couple of imports here as well. So let's import user model. Let's import a JSON object and JSON exception and all of the good stuff. So I will need to import my different classes so that I can use them without getting a bunch of errors here. Okay, so once we have all of them imported, and by the way, you can again get that code in the link in the description. Just check out the website. So basically what we need here is a list of our user model class. So this user model class is basically our model class for each and every single object that we have, for each and every single JSON object that we have. Okay, so this one here. And then in the next step, we create a list here. So in this case, it's an array list of objects that are of type user model class. So it's not of type string or int or something basic, but it's really of the type that we have defined ourselves, which is a lot more complex because it has all of those different properties, which are these ones. So properties, to be a little more precise with the pronunciation. So at this point, we have an object which is of type JSON object. So we say, okay, we want to have an object, and then we define it should be of type JSON object. And this JSON object, it requires a string JSON, and it can throw a JSON exception, and that is why we need to add this try and catch block, okay, because it can catch this exception that was thrown. Okay, so then what we do here is we get the JSON from assets, and this is an optional, that's why we need to use the double exclamation mark here. And then we get the users array from that object that we just created, and we get its JSON array called users. Okay, so if we look at our users.json, you can see that this here is called users, and it is a JSON array because it starts with a square bracket. So this here basically is a JSON array all the way down here. This is one JSON array which itself contains JSON objects. Okay, and that's what we are getting here. So we are saying, give me the users, which is of type JSON array, and store that in this variable called users array. So now with this for loop, I'm reading all of the data for every single entry inside of my users array. So for I in 0 until users array.length. So what that means is I say, go through every single object inside of your array or inside of this array. Start with the first one and go to the last one. So users array.length will be 4, so go from the first to the last one. And then from every single user that you have in there, first of all, create a user out of the complete object that you have. That will be a JSON object again. So if we look at it, this here, this part is a JSON object. Okay, so this whole thing is a JSON array, but it contains a bunch of JSON objects. And every JSON object can have a bunch of key value pairs. Okay, so this has the key of ID and the value of 1, the key of name and the value of Dennis Panuta. But it can also have, or a value can also be a JSON object itself. So this, for example, is a JSON object. And this is a key called phone, but the value of phone is a JSON object itself, which has again a key of mobile and a value of a string. And that is something that we are going to take into consideration as well here. So first of all, we get the ID. And how do we get it? Well, we get from this user, which is the users array that get JSON object at the position I. So basically in the first iteration, it will be this one. In the second iteration, it will be that one. In the third iteration, it will be that one, and so forth. Okay, so we get all of them, and for each of them, what we do is we get the JSON object, and then we treat the JSON object in our Kotlin manner, where we just say, okay, user.getInteger at the key ID. So we get the ID, then we get the name, the email, the gender, the weight, the height. Then the thing is, as you can see, the phone and the mobile and office, they are a little more complicated because while mobile and office are very easy, we also use getString here. The phone number itself, even though we won't display phone, what we will display, however, is mobile and office, but those are JSON objects themselves, or this is also a JSON object, as I explained, right? So this part here, starting from here, as it is in curly brackets, this is a JSON object again. So I need to make sure that I'm breaking it down and getting the phone object, which then contains the key value pairs, which basically means it contains the mobile with the value for mobile, as well as the office with the value for office. And now that we have all of those values, right? We have all of those basically strings and integers and doubles. So here an integer, this is an int, this is a string, 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 double, int, string, string. We get those, and we can make an object of our user model class. So we create an object with all of this information that we just got, and we create an object out of it called user details, which we then can add to our users list, because our users list, if you recall, is this array list, which is of type, or which contains elements of type user model class. So which is basically this model class here. So all of that work was really just there for us to, so this whole work here, for us to add every single object that we have here to our list, which is this array list here. Because once we are done with all of that, we have our list, which we then can assign to a recycler view. Okay, a recycler view is a list view, so to speak. So basically a way to display a list in Android. And we're saying we want to use this recycler view user list, which is going to use a linear layout manager. And then this adapter, as you might recall, it needs a context as well as a list. So let's look at user adapter once again. It needs, let's go up here. It needs a context and it needs an list of, an array list of user model classes. Now guess what? Our user list here is of exactly that type. That's why we use this type, of course. So now we have basically this list. We can give it to this item adapter, and we can give this item adapter to the recycler views adapter. And this is basically always the same structure, but that allows us to then display the JSON object data directly inside of our recycler view, which is basically a list. Now there was this method here, get JSON from assets, and you might have wondered what the heck is that, because I don't really know where this comes from. Well, the thing is, I have this extra helper method that I created, which is just for that. So it gets us the JSON from assets, and it will return a string. So it will return JSON. What is JSON? Well, it's a string nullable. That's why we have this question mark here. Basically, it's a variable that can be null or can have a value. That's what the nullable is. And then we have a char set where we use the UTF-8 char set. So if you want to know more about char sets, definitely check out char sets on the internet. I mean, I'm not going to go into char sets here, but basically there are different types of character sets, and we are using the UTF-8, which contains a bunch of characters that we are using, for example, the ones that you can see on your keyboard. Okay, and then we try something here as well, where we say the value is assets open users.json. So here, this users.json is the file that we have created in our assets folder. So that's why we use assets.open, because, well, it's in the assets folder. And we open a file with the name users.json. All right, now at this point, you might wonder what is this is. And basically, this happens when you convert from Java code to Kotlin code. This can happen. So let's say I had this variable which was called is in Java, and now I'm converting it automatically, and that's the cool thing. This IDE allows it. So, well, Android Studio allows the conversion of Java code to Kotlin code. Then this thing can happen. And in Java, is not a specific keyword. Okay, so you can call your variables is, but here you see that this is a keyword that is used in Kotlin. And this is just a little side note that you can still use variables this way, even though I wouldn't recommend doing it. So it's better if you give this a more meaningful name, like my user JSON file or something like that. That would be probably a more meaningful way, or users JSON file. That would be a more meaningful variable name. And then you come or don't come across this error. Okay, this was just a little side note for you. All right, so basically we have this JSON file now. So we open our users.json, which is this whole file, basically this complete file. And then we need to know the size of the file, and we can get the size via the .available function, which you can apply on assets that you open. Then we need to pass that to our byte array, well, the size that we just prepared, and basically this is going to be the buffer. And then you can read your file with the read method, but you need to pass the buffer. And once a file is done reading, you need to close that file reader as well. Okay, so well, you need to close the file. So we are opening the file, we're reading everything, we are storing it in the buffer, and then we're closing the file again. And at this point, what you can do is you can make a JSON object out of it, or a string object out of whatever the buffer had, and we are converting that into a char set. So basically, this is the code that you will need whenever you are reading a file, which is of, well, in this case, JSON format, but which is just a text document, so to speak, and you need to read it. Well, that's going to be the code that you are going to use for this. Okay, and because this can go wrong, we have this try block, because every time that you are reading a file, there could be something wrong. The file could be corrupt, or there could be a wrong data type or whatever. That's why we're using try and catch here. And then we are returning this JSON file, which is basically going to be of string nullable type. And that's what this get JSON from assets is going to give us. So now going up here, you can see that we get a complete JSON object out of this whole file that we created up top. And then we do all of the magic that we saw later on. And at this point, if you run your application, you will see that this is basically what you'll get. Okay, so you now have all of the items, or all of the JSON objects in a recycler view. And these are the recycler view items that we are using here. You can see we get the ID, the name, the email address, and so forth. And all of this in this particular format that we have defined. Okay, so yeah, that's basically how you can get the data from a JSON file. So let's say now we had more information here. So let's say we have a fifth entry, and this will be Frank, and his email address is going to be frank@gmail. He's male, and he has a different weight, whatever, and he is a little taller, super skinny guy. And now if we rerun this and refresh the application, you can see that Frank is also there. Okay, so this is how you can now get all of the data, and you can see it's super adjustable. So if you get more data from the web now and you refresh the application, you will see that you will get all of the data that is available and in a specific format. So now it's your job to make it more appealing and make it look like you want it. Okay, and that is the generic way, the JSON default way, so to speak, using all of the JSON available classes made directly available by Kotlin. But there is an even better way to doing all of that, and that is to use the Gson library. So now let's look at how that would look with Gson. Okay, so we still need this list here, this users list, but now we also need to make sure that we are adding another implementation to our build.gradle. So let's go to our build.gradle, to the app one, and let's add this line here, implementation com.google.code.gson :gson :2.8.6. Once you added that, you need to sync it. And now you will be able to use the Gson library. And let's have a look at how to do that. So the thing that will change now is that our data class that we had before is going to look a little different. So we had this data, well, this user model class, right? And this user model class contained the whole object basically in one class, even though if you look at it, our JSON objects that we have here are multiple ones. So this is the highest level. This is going to be the users class, which will itself contain this class type here, which is the user model class, you could say. Even though inside of that we have the phone data class, which is basically containing these two properties. So how can we convert this class that we have here into this format? Because we are not using a data class, we're using a generic class. But we could use a data class, and that's also what we need to do when we want to use Gson. Okay, so I'm going to create a data class here, which is just a more efficient and simple way of a class, which is really just there for data structures, so to speak. So I'm just gonna say that I want to have users, which will be of type ArrayList, which will be of type user model class. Okay, so now I want to have a bunch of users which are of type user model class. And now inside of this user model class, I have another data class that I will need. And by the way, let's make this also a data class. And here, this will be the phone data class. And now what are the properties that I want to have inside of this phone data class? Well, it is those two here. So let's cut them out from there. And here we are going to require a phone, which will be of type phone. Okay, so basically I broke it now down to a format which is perfect for Gson and which is also a lot more clean, so to speak. Because if we look at our data, this itself is an object, right? So phone is a JSON object. This here is a JSON object. This whole thing, this complete part here is a JSON object which contains a list of a bunch of JSON objects. Okay, and that's why it really makes sense to break it down in a cleaner fashion, which is what we just did by using data classes here. And basically, we say that our user data class basically is contains an array list of user model classes or model class objects. And in there, we have a phone, which is, or basically we have all of those different properties, right? But one of them is phone, which is by itself of our data class type phone that we created, which contains this information here. Okay, and this will be a lot more performant, and it's also a lot cleaner when it comes to more complex structures in JSON objects, because this is a rather simple structure. You can get data in a significantly more complex manner, but using Gson and preparing everything in a way that you can see here is going to be the best way to go. Okay, and let's see how we have to adjust our main activity, because you can already see that we get an error here because mobile and office are not strings anymore. So we don't have phone.getString mobile. So these two lines, they won't work anymore. All right, so now let's make the changes that are required for using it in Gson. Okay, and basically it's really a lot that we are saving here. Inside of this for loop here, or inside of our try and catch block, we can basically get rid of using everything inside of here, like this complete for loop, actually even all the way up here. So let's get rid of that. And all the way down here. So we don't need all of this part, so where we did the for loop and all of that, because Gson allows us to make it a lot shorter. So what we need is, we of course need to get the data, and we do that by using Gson here. So first of all, we get the JSON string now from our assets directly, and then we get the users from our users class. And well, thing is, did I call it users? Let's look at the data class that we have here. I called it user. Let's call it users actually. So this data class now is going to be our entry point, so to speak. And now I need to import users as well. And then I need to make sure that my layout adapter here at the bottom is actually using this users and so forth. Okay, so let me actually cut it out here and put it into the try block as well. And here now we need to make one little change, because we're not using the users list anymore, but actually we're using users directly. Okay, so we're using this users here, And what do we use from users? Well, .users. This is a little confusing, but if we look at it, it's this property here called users inside of users. Okay, so now we're using this users here, and you can see that we can even get rid of this users list that we had before. So basically what we had before was we had to create this users list, then we had the JSON object that we had to create. We had to create the users array from it. Then we had to loop through the whole array. We needed to add every single element to the array list. And then at that point, we could then start and adding everything to our adapter and everything, right? And displaying this kind of code. But now we have all of that in just 5 lines of code because, well, I have comments in here, but basically it would just be 5 lines of code because Gson is smart enough to basically get all of the data by itself. So what we just needed to do is we just needed to get the whole object, which is this complete object, and have the right structure. So basically in our user model class, use the right structure, which we did, and then Gson does all of the action for us and, well, saves us a lot of time. Okay, because at this point we can rerun our application and see if the code will still work, and well, that's perfect. So I still get these 2 errors because now in our onBind view holder things have changed, because now we don't have item.mobile directly anymore, but we have item.phone.mobile now. And the same goes for Office. So item.phone.mobile as well as item.phone.office. Because we have this new structure, right? We have this structure where our phone is a data class itself, which then contains the 2 properties that we are going to require, which is mobile and Office. So at this point, we should be able to rerun our application. So it's going to reinstall it. And let's see if we still get the list. And you can see we still get our list as we did before. So now you see that using Gson, which is a Google library, is significantly more efficient and is also going to be used in third-party libraries such as Retrofit and many other third-party libraries, because they just say, well, why shouldn't we use this beautiful third-party library called Gson if it saves us so much time and hassle and also gives us the data in the perfect format that is clean and that is just built up on each other. So once again, real quick, these 3 are basically what we have in users. So let me put it together. So this one here is our complete users object. Okay, this data class here. Then if we open it, this part, let me close this phone as well. This part here is an individual. So each of those IDs is an individual user model class. And the user model class consists of all of those properties that we had, plus the phone, which is another data class, which we then also created. So now let me adjust this real quick, just a little bit. So let's say I would go even one level further, and about the phone, I would also store even more information, such as, let's say I would have details about it. And this would itself be of another data type here. Okay, so basically it would have information about, let's say, the brand. So let's say it was Samsung. And then the model, let's say it was Fold 2. Okay. And here I'm missing the colon. So let's say we had this structure. How would you now change your whole structure up? So what would you change now? Just a little challenge for you. Try to pause the video and try to figure it out. Okay, so for this to work now, and let me actually do that for the user model directly, we would need to go ahead and say val, and here's a comma missing, val details, and I would create a new data class here called details, and it would contain information about the brand, which is a string, and the model, which is also a string. Okay, so this would be then of type details. And now, at least our class here, or this model class, or this model file, so to speak, follows the same structure as I had here with my JSON file. Now, of course, it wouldn't appear anywhere. We wouldn't display it anywhere, because if we look at it, our user adapter has no clue what this details is about, as well as our XML file doesn't know about details, so we don't have details in here. So we would have to adjust those as well. But that's not what I wanted to talk about or focus on. I really just wanted to focus on the structure that you would have to take care of with your data class as well as your JSON file and so forth. Okay, so if you want to, you can of course now try to then implement the details as well to add basically the XML entry. So add another text view just underneath it, for example, with the additional information and so forth. Okay, I'd say that's pretty much it for Gson and JSON and all of the good stuff. So I hope this helped you out. I hope you have a better understanding of how to use JSON objects now and what JSON objects are and how you can use them in Android directly using Kotlin, but at the same time also using this third-party library called Gson, which does a lot of this action for you and saves you a lot of time and headaches later on, because this really makes your whole development process significantly easier as well as more secure, because things just don't go wrong this quickly if you use this Gson instead of JSON. All right, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you now understand what JSON is and Gson is and how to use those to now being able to use online data or data that you get from APIs, of course, as well as JSON objects that you get in other formats. All right, so now what you need to do is to check out one of those videos and of course, not forget to hit that like button. All right, I hope to see you in the next video. Have a nice day.